When love turns to hate, watch out. A jilted wife takes out the competition.
She was going to take care of this problem once and for all.
A good time girl is running low on charm.
She was desperate. She was actually at the end. She had no other options.
And unrequited love pushes a woman to the edge.
There's easier ways to kill someone, but that's not what she...
I can't believe they're all grown up.
You could say empty nesters, Shannon and Roscoe Griffin, met on Cloud 9.
Oh, it was a farewell gift.
Their 25-year romance is courtesy of NASA.
Shannon graduated with a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering. She was training astronauts.
He was in the Air Force, and her work with NASA brought them together.
But the high-stress job takes its toll. A seizure puts Shannon on indefinite sick leave.
Only 3 years before the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff. I'm guessing it took quite a toll on her.
50-year-old Shannon retires to a quiet life on a farm in Worth County, Missouri.
Yes, sir. No, that won't be a problem.
Husband Roscoe goes along with it for a while. But at 52, he decides he's not ready to quit working.
Who's that?
I got the job in Kansas.
Roscoe found a job teaching in Lyons, Kansas.
It's a real opportunity, Shannon.
I'm now moving to Kansas.
We'll work something out. Shannon, we will. We'll work something out. Shannon!
The once happy couple now live apart.
It's approximately a 9-hour drive.
He's lived part of the time in Kansas, and after a while, he was in Kansas almost all the time.
Hey, hon.
Hi. How's it going?
Hey, when you coming up here?
I don't know.
Shannon?
No one is happy anymore. Then Roscoe suffers another blow. A close friend in the service commits suicide, leaving him devastated.
Could you tell he was so depressed?
No. No, he hit it well.
He confides in 46-year-old doctor Irina Puskaru.
Irina was a psychiatrist working for the VA hospital in Kansas.
I'm so sorry, but it's time for my next appointment. We can continue this next time.
I don't suppose we could continue this over dinner.
It is a cardinal rule, an ethics issue, for a therapist to become involved with their patient.
Yes,
Great.
I like it.
But Irina didn't let that stop her.
Irina is just the medicine Roscoe needs.
They claim they fell in love, and the relationship became romantic.
The affair remains a secret. Until, on their 20th wedding anniversary, Roscoe decides to tell his wife through social media.
It was devastating to Shannon.
Some might take that as saying, the last 20 years with you have been horrible, and now I've replaced you.
Shannon was initially despondent. Shannon decided to fight for her marriage and try to make it work with Roscoe.
But Roscoe wants his cake and eat it too. He agrees the two women can meet.
Roscoe had informed Shannon that he was meeting Irina, and she told him, no, I'm going to come along with you to this meeting.
Shannon's plan is simple.
Irene, this is Shannon, my wife.
She wanted Roscoe to tell Irina that the affair was over.
You were gonna listen to me because I'm
Shannon.
gonna say this
Shannon,
only
calm down.
once. You need to stay away from
Shannon.
my husband. If you do
All
not
right,
stay
stop,
away
Shannon.
from him, I will destroy you and your
Shannon,
career.
stop.
Do you hear me?
It's my understanding that the meeting did not go well.
You stay away from him. In
Shannon.
fact, just shut up, Roscoe.
It was a very short meeting with some words exchanged.
Does everybody in this room hear me? That this
Shannon.
woman is sleeping with my husband.
Irina.
Everybody, do they hear me?
Shannon!
Shut up.
And they went their separate ways. Roscoe left with Shannon.
Shannon seems to have won. But this is just the first round, because Roscoe is still seeing his lover.
Roscoe didn't stick to his word in ending that affair. Him and Irina continued to have contact.
Shannon had a job to do. She had to save her husband. She had to save her marriage from this evil woman.
Shannon Griffin is on a mission to save her marriage.
You stay there.
She and Roscoe attend a counseling session.
I'm sure he's still seeing her.
Shannon's understanding that that meeting was going to be a type of marital counseling session whereby they could work on their relationship.
But I do want to see Irina. I can't help the way I feel.
I can't help the way I feel.
Roscoe says he does not want to end his relationship with Irina. Shannon is furious and storms out.
She gives her husband one last chance to change his mind.
Shannon, where are you?
How could you, Roscoe? How could you let that woman ruin our lives?
We're not happy, Shannon. So look, either we go ahead with a divorce, or we'll stay married, and then I'll just see Irina on the weekend.
It's the wrong answer.
She leaves Roscoe a very ominous note. She says, "It's obvious you can't deal with this, so I will."
That same day, January 13th, 2012, Shannon drives 250 miles through the night to reach Gladstone, Missouri, the home of Dr. Irina Puskaru.
Irina answered the door. Shannon walked into the house and Irina backed into the house. And shot Irina 3 times. Irina fell to the floor. And Shannon walked over to her and pointed the gun at her face and shot a 4th time.
It was a very personal crime and extremely violent and extremely up close.
I'm not gonna let you have what you want. Bang, bang, she's dead, and it's your fault.
There were pieces of bone and teeth scattered across the floor.
This tragedy is made worse. There is an eyewitness.
Her mother was there, and her mother saw every single minute of one shot after another as her daughter drops to the ground, blood spraying everywhere. It was a brutal, brutal scene to view.
After Shannon had shot Irina, she got in her car and she made a series of phone calls.
It's me.
One of the phone calls she made was to Roscoe,
She's dead.
and she confessed
I killed her.
and said she had done the killing for him,
This isn't the first time she's hurt someone, but it'll be the last.
to protect him from, in Shannon's words, that evil woman. Roscoe then called 911.
Hello? Yes.
The police track her down within hours.
Step out of the car, please, ma'am.
She wasn't the kind of person to go on the run after committing a crime. So she gave herself up very easily and faced the music.
Satisfied her job is done, Shannon happily cooperates.
Shannon ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder. And she never went to trial.
In 2015, Shannon Griffin is sentenced to 20 years for second-degree murder and 20 years for armed criminal action.
Shannon didn't have a criminal history at all. She didn't even have speeding tickets. According to Roscoe, she was the type of person that would make him stop on the side of the highway to help an injured animal. She had not exhibited any kind of violent behavior prior to this shooting.
Shannon, a brilliant scientist who understands the laws of physics, couldn't deal with more earthly forces. Matters of the heart are her undoing.
I think Shannon wanted Irina out of the picture. I don't think this was a heat-of-the-moment thing. I think she had time to consider her crime.
She just didn't want to kill Irina. She wanted to obliterate her essence. And she did.
When a woman has nothing to gain,
She's almost like a child.
but everything to lose,
This is a person who is becoming undone.
all bets are off.
And that's when the tornado started.
Some women like to tease.
George? Hi!
36-year-old Patricia Tito is a professional.
You buy me a drink?
Not tonight, Tricia.
Patricia Tito really thought very highly of herself and her sexual power over men.
Fred? Hi!
Oh, baby.
I haven't seen you in so long.
You look beautiful.
You buy me a drink?
Sure, what you want to drink, honey?
Bourbon.
2 bourbons.
She works the rooms of Shreveport, Louisiana, for more than pleasure.
She used her sexuality to get what she wanted.
For her, it's a living.
Say, any chance of a loan?
She wasn't a quote-unquote prostitute, but she slept with men to get what she wanted.
Come on, you know I'm worth it.
All right.
Patricia's method of getting money for herself was through a man's wallet.
Once she figured out she could manipulate and con and charm her way into a man's bed and then get whatever she wanted, she ran with it.
Tricia, you ain't no customer. Now get back to work.
Occasionally, Patricia has to make ends meet. the old-fashioned way.
She worked a little bit on and off, but she never kept a job. One time she had some sort of job in a restaurant as a waitress.
Hi.
Hi there. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, doing well, thank you. You have some specials that look mighty fine.
The brownie is delicious.
Every man is fair game for Patricia, as long as they have the means and the desire.
Did you make it?
No, I could have lied. But I did make the...
47-year-old Chris Shufflin ticks all the boxes.
I'll have one of those, please.
Okay. I'll be back.
Thank you.
Chris was self-employed in the oil business. I mean, he could take care of himself.
Patricia has a string of men to pay her way, but Chris starts looking like her best bet.
Patricia didn't have much, but when she met Chris, she won the lottery. She saw a pot of gold.
He was lucrative. He had plenty of cash. He wasn't hurting for money.
If you want to be with Patricia, the money needs to keep coming.
Patricia wasn't looking for a soulmate. She was looking for a line of credit.
You know, he would give her checks like between $200 and $1,500, right? To live on.
Chris is an easy mark.
Trish, you're gonna send me to the poorhouse.
But I'm worth it.
Yes, you are.
Chris was passive. He probably would have struggled with telling someone no.
Can I also get $150 for my hair?
Why not? 150.
Thank you.
She had a roof over her head and she had money in her pocket, and it was all from him.
Here you go, honey.
For a year, Patricia is riding high.
I'll see you later.
Until
Chris has a stroke.
Hey, hon.
Hey, how you doing, Tricia?
Good. You're looking good.
Am I? I don't feel so good.
It's good to see you.
At first, Patricia's full of sympathy.
Baby, I'm doing it real hard. Can I have some money?
What the hell? Tricia, I can't continue to give you any money.
Until she realizes Chris has lost his income.
Probably it was going to take him a year or two to get back up to full strength. He had just reached that point he couldn't afford it anymore.
I'm not even working now.
Then screw you.
Tricia. Tricia.
Bound to happen sooner or later, and here it is, happening.
Patricia dumps Chris as quickly as she found him and returns to her former lines of credit.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, Patricia.
How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, what do you want?
But since she's hooked on Chris, her other men have moved on.
Patricia, don't call me again.
You don't have to be like that.
I said, don't call me again.
Fine, I won't.
Her old connections were gone, some of them deceased, some of them no longer would have anything to do with her.
Patricia has to face reality. Her credit around town is exhausted. Her only chance is to make amends with Chris. But she's too late.
Judy Wynn is this 59-year-old secretary. Everybody loves her.
He moved on with another woman, and another woman that was significantly older than Patricia Tito. And that did not sit well with Patricia Tito.
Patricia was struggling to maintain what, at some point in her life, was pretty good, her looks. She was losing him.
I'll get you back.
And now she loses Chris to a woman 21 years older than she was. That had to hurt.
A woman scorned for love, watch out. A woman scorned for love and money, that could be deadly.
Shreveport, Louisiana. Patricia Tito wants her man back, and there's one person in her way. His new girlfriend, Judy Wynn.
Tricia was desperate. She had gotten into a desperate situation.
She vandalizes Judy's car by throwing paint all over it.
The way I read the message, it's your car today, it's you next.
This is a person who is becoming undone.
Patricia was a woman on a mission, and her mission was to get Judy.
On August 31st, 2003, Patricia makes her intentions clear.
You better sleep with one eye open. You hear me?
In those phone calls, there was rage, extreme rage.
Let me tell you something, partner. I get a hold of Judy Wynn. Ain't nobody on God's green earth gonna make her recognizable.
You better sleep with one eye open. Once I get a hold of Judy Wynn, she's gonna become unrecognizable.
Do you hear me, Chris? Huh? Do you hear me?
I listened to all of the voicemails, and I can tell you that they sent chills up my spine. As a long-term career prosecutor, I've really never heard such evil and hatred in someone's voice.
Won't even know what hit you.
You knew somebody was gonna die.
That's it. I'm gonna call the police. It's ridiculous. Yes.
But it's too late.
There was really no time for the police to act.
Patricia Tito was ice pick crazy. She was just that full of rage and anger.
So Judy's washing dishes, doing her housework, and suddenly she sees somebody outside, and you know what? Guess who it is? It's Patricia.
No one can know what was going through Judy's mind when she spotted Patricia with the gun pointed at her. She didn't even have time to respond.
Judy! Stay with me.
Chris comes downstairs.
Stay with me.
And finds her in the floor. She's shot in the chest, bleeding badly.
Stay with me, baby. Stay with me.
She says, Tricia shot me. Trish Tito shot me.
Stay with me. Stay with me. Yes, we have an emergency at 14 Kent Street, Shreveport.
Judy dies of a single gunshot to the chest.
Stay with me, baby. Stay with me, all right? Stay with me.
But what happens next isn't the outcome Trisha desires.
Chris isn't gonna come running into her arms after she kills his girlfriend. It's not gonna happen that way, but she believes it will.
Patricia Tito is wanted in relation.
It's not Chris who comes running. It's the police, with a trail of evidence, a death threat, and the victim's dying testimony. Patricia is the obvious prime suspect.
Here, we don't have a case that Columbo needs to step in and solve, you know? She knew her number was up.
Patricia is cornered and broke with nowhere to hide. All she has now is the mercy of the justice system.
She eventually just walked to the front of the police station and said that she was wanted and she was here to turn herself in.
She ended up pleading guilty to manslaughter, which in Louisiana is a heat of passion killing.
In 2004, Patricia Tito receives 40 years in prison for manslaughter. She will no longer be admired or bankrolled by men. For her, love is a transaction, and rejection never an option.
Jealousy isn't the only motivator, but it is the one that makes people crazy.
What does it take?
It must have been humiliating and embarrassing.
To push a good woman.
She wanted to get rid of her.
Over the edge.
This is like a train on fire headed off a cliff.
Sydney, Australia. Many migrants come here to build their dreams. Manisha Patel and her husband arrived in 2008. But within a year, they have troubles.
Manisha had two serious blows in her life to deal with. One was the failure of her marriage. The second, not being able to work as an engineer in Australia.
No, I got my bachelor's in India. Okay, thank you.
Her qualifications were not recognised, so she took a series of less qualified jobs.
That had to be hard to deal with.
Manisha needs a lift. Luckily, she knows where to go.
She went to an Indian matrimonial website. She wanted to make sure she found someone Indian, somebody from the same sort of background as her. That was very important to her.
Niraj Dave is looking for the same thing.
This site is for people who are genuinely looking for somebody to marry.
Try this, try mine.
It's okay.
It's delicious.
Their chemistry is good, and they have a lot in common.
Niraj, also from India, also has a bachelor's degree in engineering and also unable to find employment in that field. They bonded.
So the lovebirds nest.
They became really close really quickly and moved into her shared apartment together.
The future looks bright again. Manisha thinks she's found her new man. But life isn't that simple.
Manisha wasn't the only woman in Niraj's life when they were living together.
Niraj's parents were actively looking for a new spouse for him.
Her new Romeo is seeing another woman, virtually, back in India.
You look like that Bollywood actress.
Which one? Priyanka Chopra?
Yes, that one.
A young woman in India named Purvi. and they fell for each other.
My God, those eyes. Are you as beautiful in person?
Well, you'll find out very soon.
Purvi was a highly educated and vibrant woman.
You're gonna love it here.
Well, I'm scared of sharks, so I'm not coming anywhere near them.
Don't worry. You'll be safe.
Manisha knew none of this.
Who's that?
Oh, just an old friend.
Manisha saw that Niraj was talking to Purvi, but Niraj had told her that Purvi was just...
What? Who? It's been arranged by our families.
Around about the same time, Niraj tells Manisha that he is going to get married.
He had impregnated her. They were still acting like husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. And now he tells her, sorry, you're not good enough for me. I'm marrying somebody else.
Perfect.
But Manisha isn't giving up. She wants to imagine a woman on the other side of the world isn't really a threat.
We love it.
Great. I've got the tenancy agreement here if you'd like to sign.
Yeah, sure.
She even helps Niraj secure an apartment. He agrees that she can move in, but into the spare room. She's no longer welcome in his bed, and she must leave when his new girlfriend arrives.
Manisha was willing to humiliate herself, do anything to be close to Niraj, because she was hoping to change his mind.
But Manisha is on a collision course with fate.
Like a train on fire headed off a cliff.
In Sydney, Australia,
Try this.
Manisha Patel will do anything to keep her man Niraj.
It's delicious.
Although he's pledged himself to another woman, Manisha won't give up easily.
She couldn't do enough to keep his attention on her. She didn't see it wasn't working.
Her rival is about to arrive, and Manisha has to make way.
Got to go to the airport. Put it down.
Yeah, okay.
We have to go, okay?
I certainly don't think Manisha gave any indication to him about how she was feeling. She bottled it up inside.
Welcome to your new home. Upstairs.
As soon as Purvi arrives, Manisha is out of the picture.
Coming from India, 28-year-old Purvi Joshi has no idea her fiancé has been cheating.
I love it.
Are you sure?
Yes. I love it and I love it.
Don't worry, it's just a movie.
But Manisha doesn't give up.
Hi, what's up?
I need your help. I'm so scared.
The fact that Niraj was now living with his bride-to-be didn't stop Manisha from loving him or trying to be with him.
What's wrong?
A friend's in trouble.
Manisha was keeping in close contact with Niraj. She was phoning him and texting him.
Yeah, sure. Come over.
Manisha meets her replacement.
Purvi had no idea Manisha existed, but Manisha knew all about Purvi.
Seeing Niraj and Purvi together just came to really crystallize for her just how desperate her situation was.
On July 30th, 2013, Manisha is up earlier than usual.
Ostensibly, she was getting up that early to go to work.
Manisha's flatmate saw her kneeling and praying in front of a shrine, something she had never seen Manisha do before.
Manisha doesn't like the new arrangement, so she's going to make it right. She still has a key to her old apartment.
She let herself into the apartment using the keys that she had. She knew that Niraj wouldn't be there. Niraj was working as a security guard, often doing overnight shifts.
Her anger had been misplaced from Niraj to Purvi, and she wanted to get rid of her.
Manisha crept into the bedroom. She put her hand over Purvi's throat, and she put her hands around her neck and started choking her.
Manisha used the element of surprise.
Movies would have you think that choking someone only takes 15 seconds. It actually takes a tremendous amount of strength.
Manisha never wavered. She had a serious intent to kill.
But that wasn't the end of it. Then Manisha stabbed her twice after she was dead.
As she flees, Manisha makes a feeble attempt to cover her tracks.
She took Purvi's handbag and she spread the contents around on the floor to make it look like somebody had broken in and attacked Purvi.
Manisha thinks she's reset the clock.
She thinks that with Purvi out of the picture, she and Niraj can get back to having life as it was. The life that she knew and the life that she obviously loved with him.
Niraj returns home from work,
Purvi!
only to discover his worst nightmare.
Purvi! Purvi! Purvi!
Purvi is new to the country, but Niraj knows one person who would want her dead. And by coincidence, Manisha too has been stabbed.
Hi, Manisha. How you feeling?
I'm okay, sir.
What happened again on the night of the stabbing?
There were two of them.
Two.
They wore masks, so I couldn't see their faces.
Manisha said that she was attacked by two men as she was walking home.
Then one of them stabbed me here.
Manisha also stabbed herself.
It's an alibi to divert suspicion and get Niraj's sympathy.
Get well.
But her story quickly falls apart. When the police check surveillance video of the victim's residence.
Footage that showed her walking from her car to Niraj and Purvi's apartment.
When confronted with the evidence, she admits to the killing, but claims self-defense. But again, her story falls short. Manisha's jealous history and self-inflicted wounds simply hasten her road to trial. In 2015, Manisha Patel is convicted of murder and sentenced to 24 years in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2033.
Manisha is highly unlikely to kill again. Like most people convicted of murder, she had a very specific reason and motivation for doing it, and that's over.
Manisha's anger stole the promising life of an innocent, hoping to make her future on the other side of the world. Purvey is the victim of someone who, under different circumstances, might have been a friend.
Manisha had never been in trouble with the law before. She'd always been a good person.
In May 2017, an Australian appeals court set aside Manisha Patel's conviction. She remains behind bars, awaiting a retrial next year. These deadly women couldn't accept rejection. Shannon Griffin assassinated her rival, Patricia Tito.
At 6:42 a.m., the front gate was still locked, the driveway empty, the house breathing in silence, and somewhere between the click of a security camera and the rising sun, a woman with a fortune to her name disappeared without leaving a sound, without leaving a trace, without leaving behind a body. A goodbye or a reason that made sense. And in that quiet gap, a cold case was born, one that would gnaw at a town, stain a family name, and harden into legend as the years piled up like dust on an unused file. The house stood at the edge of the bay, glass and steel pressed against the water, a symbol of old money and newer ambition. And inside it lived Eleanor Whitmore, heiress to a shipping empire, 32 years old, recently returned from Europe, recently engaged. Recently photographed smiling under chandeliers and flashbulbs, the kind of woman whose life appeared fully documented, fully protected, fully accounted for, until the morning her bed was empty, her phone was gone, and her slippers were still placed neatly beside the door as if she intended to come back. Police arrived to a scene that felt staged by absence. No broken windows, no forced entry, no blood, no struggle. Only a back door unlocked, and a faint smell of salt carried in from the water. A detail that meant nothing at first, and later meant too much. Because this was not a crime that announced itself, it whispered, and whispers are harder to chase. The community reacted the way wealthy communities do when something ugly intrudes, with disbelief first, then denial, then fear, because if someone like Eleanor could vanish, guarded by alarms and money and reputation, then safety itself had just been exposed as a fragile illusion. And suddenly every locked door felt thinner. Every stranger felt closer. Detectives began where they always begin, with routine, with interviews, with lists, with timelines scribbled in notebooks that would soon grow thick and heavy. And they spoke to the fiancé, who said he last saw her the night before, calm, distracted, already rehearsed in his grief. They spoke to the house staff who noticed nothing unusual, who heard no screams, who smelled no smoke, who felt no tremor in the walls. And they spoke to neighbors who slept through the night, unaware that history was rearranging itself one silent minute at a time. Her car was still in the garage, keys in their place, passport untouched, bank accounts quiet. And this was the first fracture in logic, because disappearances leave patterns and Eleanor Whitmore's life showed none. No preparations, no withdrawals, no messages typed and erased in the dark. Nothing that suggested she wanted to run or needed to hide. And that absence of motive would become the case's most stubborn enemy. Search teams swept the shoreline. Divers cut through the cold water. Helicopters traced slow circles overhead. And for a moment the town held its breath, believing the ocean would give her back, believing the mystery would resolve itself into something tragic, but explainable. But the water stayed empty, the days passed, and the headlines shifted from urgent to anxious, from breaking news to lingering question. Within a week, the language changed, not officially, not on paper, but in tone and posture, in the way detectives looked at one another when they thought no one was watching, because this was no longer a missing person, it was becoming a puzzle. And puzzles demand someone on the other side. Someone who moved her. Someone who knew the house. Someone who understood how to erase a human being without triggering an alarm. Rumors spread faster than facts. Whispers about family feuds, about inheritance clauses buried in legal language, about a business deal gone wrong overseas, about secrets Eleanor might have carried back with her when she returned home, and each rumor added weight to the case without adding clarity, turning the investigation into a maze where every turn looked promising and led nowhere. Detectives found a smear on the back door frame. Not blood, not paint, something organic, something too degraded to identify, logged as evidence, boxed, labeled, and shelved in a room already filling with objects that meant less with every passing month. And somewhere in that room, time began its slow work, dulling edges, fading urgency, teaching everyone involved how to live with not knowing. The Whitmore family hired private investigators, former federal agents, men with short hair and longer resumes, and for a while it felt like progress, like momentum, like pressure might force the truth to surface. But parallel investigations collided and contradicted, egos clashed, theories multiplied, and the case began to fracture under the weight of too many answers that couldn't be proven. A gardener came forward claiming he saw a light near the water after midnight, then recanted, then disappeared from town entirely. A neighbor reported hearing a boat engine, then admitted it might have been a dream, and every false start chipped away at the case's credibility, teaching the public to be skeptical, teaching the press to move on, teaching the investigators to lower their voices when they said her name. Months turned into years, and Eleanor Whitmore's face froze in time on missing posters that yellowed and curled at the corners, a smile from another life staring out from supermarket bulletin boards and police websites, slowly becoming less a call for help and more a memorial for uncertainty. Inside the department, the file grew thick enough to demand its own shelf, then its own cabinet, and eventually its own label, cold case. Two words that sound clinical, but carry a quiet accusation, because cold means untouched, and case means unfinished. And together they admit what no one wants to say out loud, that the trail has gone cold because no one knows where to look next. Detectives retired, transferred, passed the file down to younger hands who read it like a ghost story, familiarizing themselves with names that no longer lived in town, streets that had been renamed, businesses that had closed, and with each transition, something intangible slipped away. Context, instinct, the subtle sense of what felt wrong on the day she vanished. Yet the case never fully died, because every few years a strange tip surfaced, a letter mailed from nowhere, a call placed and disconnected, a supposed sighting in a distant city, and each time the wound reopened, the headlines flared. And the nation remembered the vanished heiress who seemed to exist only in headlines and speculation. For the Whitmores, time did not heal. It calcified, grief turning rigid and heavy, lawyers arguing in quiet rooms about death declarations and estates, while family members avoided cameras and learned to speak about Eleanor in the past tense without officially admitting she was gone. A linguistic compromise with a mystery that refused to resolve. 30 years passed like this, the case aging into folklore, cited in true crime books, whispered about in law schools, referenced in lectures about perfect disappearances, until one winter morning, a call came into a precinct far from the bay, routed through layers of skepticism and protocol. A voice on the line claiming knowledge, not rumor, not theory, but involvement. At first it sounded like all the others, disjointed, nervous, tinged with drama, but there was something in the pauses, something in the way details surfaced unprompted, specific things that had never been released, and the officer taking the call felt it. That shift in the air when routine fractures into possibility. The file was pulled from storage, dust wiped from its spine, evidence re-examined with modern eyes, modern tools, and suddenly the cold case was breathing again. Alarms triggered, names resurfaced, and across the country, a story long thought finished began to write itself forward, not with answers, but with the promise of shock. Because when a voice from the past finally speaks, it doesn't just confess to a crime. It confesses to decades of silence. And in that silence, a nation had learned to live with not knowing, unaware that the truth had been waiting, patient, heavy, and ready to fall like a hammer the moment someone decided to talk. The call did not come with urgency. It came with fatigue. a voice worn thin by years of carrying something too heavy to keep and too dangerous to release. And as the words filtered through the receiver, measured, cautious, incomplete, the officer listening realized this was not a man seeking attention. This was someone negotiating with his own memory, testing how much truth he could say without collapsing under it. He did not give his name at first, only a location, a county 2 states away, a place with no visible connection to a vanished heiress or a waterfront mansion. And that distance alone was unsettling because it suggested movement, intention. A life lived beyond the moment everyone else had frozen in 1993. And when asked how he knew about Eleanor Whitmore, he paused just long enough to reveal fear, then said quietly that he'd been there that night, close enough to smell the salt, close enough to hear the house settle as the tide shifted. Investigators reopened the file with the careful reverence reserved for dangerous things, aware that old cases carry old mistakes, and every page turn felt like an accusation aimed at the past, how it had been missed, what had been dismissed, what had been quietly set aside because it didn't fit. And as the name of the caller was finally recorded, a name that appeared nowhere in the original investigation, a new axis formed around which the entire case began to tilt. He was not family, not staff, not neighbor, not listed in any guest book or security log. Yet he described the house with the intimacy of someone who had moved through it in the dark, knew which floorboard creaked, which hallway light flickered, which door had been left unlocked out of habit rather than carelessness. And those details tightened the room, made seasoned detectives exchange glances that said this was no fantasy. This was recollection. The man claimed he had not acted alone, that Eleanor had trusted someone else, someone closer, someone whose name had been printed in newspapers for years without ever drawing suspicion. And though he refused to say the name outright, the implications spread like smoke, curling into every corner of the room, touching old theories, old tensions, old grudges that had never fully faded. Re-interviews began quietly, deliberately, designed not to alert the press, but secrets have a way of leaking, and within days, reporters were circling the story again, dusting off headlines that had been dormant for decades, talking about a cold case reopened, about a confession that might finally shatter the illusion of permanence that wealth and time had provided. The fiancé was now a widower in everything but law, remarried, relocated, his life layered with new routines and new identities. Yet when detectives knocked on his door, the past rushed back with the force of a breaking wave. And those who watched the footage later would note how quickly his composure shifted, how his answers were precise but oddly distant, as if he were reciting a story he had practiced long ago. Financial records were pulled again, this time digitized, cross-referenced with tools that hadn't existed in the 90s, and patterns emerged where once there had been noise, small transfers, deferred accounts, shell companies that trace back to a night no one had ever fully accounted for. And suddenly motive, once the case's greatest absence, began to take shape, sharp and uncomfortable. The caller agreed to meet under conditions, neutral ground, no cameras, no guarantees, and when he finally sat across from investigators, older than his voice had suggested, eyes ringed with exhaustion, he did not look like a criminal mastermind or a monster. He looked like a man eroded by time, by guilt, by the slow realization that silence does not protect, it corrodes. He spoke in fragments, the way people do when memory hurts, describing a plan that began as something else entirely, something transactional, something meant to end with Eleanor alive, scared perhaps, displaced perhaps, but breathing. And it was in the unraveling of that plan, he said, that everything went wrong, that panic replaced reason, that choices narrowed until there were none left that didn't involve crossing a line that cannot be uncrossed. According to him, the house's security had been bypassed, not by force, but by familiarity, codes shared, routines exploited, and Eleanor had followed someone she trusted into the night, believing it was temporary, believing she would return before morning. And as he said this, investigators felt the weight of a truth they could not yet prove but could no longer ignore. Search areas were redefined, not the water this time, but land routes, storage facilities, properties tied to long-defunct businesses, and in one such place, a warehouse slated for demolition. Forensic teams uncovered traces that had survived 3 decades of neglect. Fibers matching the mansion's interior, soil inconsistent with the surrounding area, small, stubborn clues that suggested the past had not been as thoroughly erased as everyone believed. The nation watched as the story shifted from mystery to reckoning, commentators arguing about justice delayed, about the ethics of confessions after 30 years, about whether truth still matters when it arrives too late to heal, and beneath the noise, the Whitmore name resurfaced, no longer as a symbol of glamour, but as a reminder that power does not insulate against consequence, it only delays it. The caller's account grew darker as sessions continued, revealing fractures between accomplices, disagreements over money, over silence, over what should be done with a woman who knew too much and could not be allowed to walk away. And while he stopped short of describing the end, the shape of it loomed, heavy, unmistakable, a void into which Eleanor Whitmore had vanished. Yet for all the new motion, the case resisted closure, because confessions demand corroboration and memory, especially guilty memory, is an unreliable narrator, and detectives found themselves caught between momentum and caution. Aware that one wrong move could collapse the entire structure they were only beginning to rebuild. When asked why he had come forward now, after 30 years of quiet, the man hesitated, then spoke of illness, of children asking questions, of nights where the past refused to stay buried. And that answer, more than any detail, resonated with those listening, because it revealed a truth older than the law, that secrets age poorly, that time does not make them lighter, it makes them heavier. As winter deepened, the investigation pressed on, every development layered over decades of absence, and the public, once content with mystery, now demanded resolution, unaware that the closer one gets to the truth, the more fragile it becomes, and that some answers, once uncovered, do not bring peace. They bring consequences that ripple outward, touching lives that had long believed themselves untouched. And somewhere between the confession and the proof, between memory and evidence, the cold case hovered in a dangerous state, no longer dormant, not yet resolved, vibrating with the possibility that the story everyone thought they knew was about to fracture completely, revealing not just how Eleanor Whitmore vanished, but why so many people had benefited from her silence. The first arrest did not come with handcuffs or flashing lights. It came with paperwork, subpoenas sliding across polished desks, quiet conversations behind closed doors, and the unmistakable tension of people realizing that a story they thought was buried had begun to surface in pieces sharp enough to cut. Because reopening a cold case does not feel like revival, it feels like excavation, and excavation is violent to whatever has settled above it. The name the caller had avoided saying finally emerged from the silence, not as an accusation, but as a gravity while pulling every detail toward it. A business associate whose proximity to Eleanor Whitmore had always been explained away as routine, whose presence at charity galas and board meetings had been so ordinary it felt invisible. And as investigators traced his movements in the months before the disappearance, patterns appeared that had never been questioned because no one had thought to look. Phone records from the early 90s, once too fragmented to matter, now reconstructed with modern precision, revealed late-night calls, brief, repeated, always routed through the same intermediary, and when layered against security logs and travel schedules, they formed a map not of spontaneity, but of planning, careful and methodical, designed to appear casual while hiding intent. Witnesses who had once shrugged off odd encounters were contacted again, older now, less certain of their own memories but more willing to speak. And one recalled seeing Eleanor arguing softly with a man near the marina days before she vanished, his posture calm, reassuring, his hand resting on her arm in a way that suggested familiarity rather than threat. And that detail mattered, because it aligned with the confession's most unsettling claim that Eleanor had walked into her own disappearance. The fiancé's alibi, long accepted without scrutiny, began to show hairline fractures, not enough to collapse, but enough to raise questions, gaps measured in minutes, explanations that relied on routine rather than proof. And as detectives pressed gently, deliberately, the atmosphere shifted from cooperation to caution, from shared grief to guarded distance. Evidence from the warehouse was sent to labs, fibers and soil subjected to tests that had not existed when Eleanor vanished, and while none of it carried the clarity of a fingerprint or a name, it carried consistency, the quiet alignment of facts that resist coincidence, suggesting movement, transfer, a body once present where no body should have been. The caller, now formally identified, watched these developments with visible strain, his statements growing more detailed, as if he sensed the window closing, and he described a night thick with tension, a plan unraveling faster than anyone expected. Eleanor realizing too late that the assurances she had been given were incomplete, that what was framed as temporary had no clear end. He spoke of arguments, of raised voices swallowed by wind off the water, of a decision made not out of rage but out of calculation, and that distinction unsettled investigators more than any act of violence might have, because it suggested a crime committed not in passion, but in cold assessment of risk and reward. The press latched onto the word confession, but those inside the investigation avoided it, preferring cooperation, testimony, narrative, anything that did not promise more than could be delivered, because history had taught them how easily public certainty can turn into public fury when expectations outpace proof. As scrutiny intensified, financial pressure mounted on those connected to the case, accounts frozen, assets questioned, and in that tightening net, relationships frayed, lawyers issued statements carefully crafted to say nothing, and the town by the bay, long resigned to mystery, found itself reliving the night it had tried so hard to forget. Old photographs resurfaced, Eleanor laughing at events, standing between men whose smiles now looked rehearsed, whose proximity felt ominous in hindsight, and social media dissected every frame, every glance, turning memory into evidence and speculation into verdict. A process as relentless as it was irreversible. Behind the scenes, investigators confronted a harder truth, that even if they could establish who planned the disappearance, proving what ultimately happened to Eleanor Whitmore remained elusive, because absence leaves room for doubt, and doubt is fertile ground for defense. Search teams returned to sites long dismissed, guided by fragments from the caller's account, places altered by development, paved over, repurposed, and in one such location, beneath layers of concrete and time, ground-penetrating scans revealed anomalies, shapes that did not belong, and the air around the operation grew heavy with anticipation and dread. The excavation drew crowds despite efforts at secrecy, cameras pressed against barriers, commentators narrating every movement as if resolution were guaranteed. And in that spectacle, the investigation felt its most dangerous pull, the temptation to declare progress before truth was fully in hand. When the dig concluded, what emerged was inconclusive, disturbed soil, traces of organic matter too degraded to identify, enough to deepen suspicion but not enough to end the story. And the disappointment rippled outward, fueling skepticism, reigniting theories that Eleanor had escaped, had been moved, had never been there at all. The caller reacted with visible panic, insisting they were close, that the truth lay just beyond what could be proven, his voice cracking under the weight of having said too much and not enough. And in that moment, investigators saw the limits of confession without corroboration, the fragile bridge between memory and evidence. Meanwhile, the person at the center of the growing storm maintained silence, shielded by counsel and distance, issuing statements that framed the renewed investigation as tragedy exploited. Grief reopened for spectacle, and for many watching, that narrative felt uncomfortably plausible, because the case had always lived at the intersection of loss and curiosity. As weeks passed, momentum slowed, not stopped, but strained by legal thresholds and procedural caution, and the cold case, now warmer than it had been in decades, hovered in uncertainty, threatening to slip back into ambiguity if the next move failed. Yet something fundamental had changed, because the question was no longer whether Eleanor Whitmore vanished, but how many people had known, how many had benefited, and how many years of silence had been purchased with her absence. The caller, once anonymous, now a central figure, requested one final meeting, hinting at information he had withheld out of fear. And as preparations were made, investigators understood that whatever came next would not just shape the case. It would redefine it, because some truths, once spoken, cannot be contained, and some silences, once broken, demand a reckoning far larger than the crime itself. And as the nation watched, divided between belief and doubt, the vanished heiress remained at the center of it all, not as a victim frozen in time, but as a presence pulling the present backward, forcing everyone to confront the cost of secrets kept for 30 years, and the unsettling possibility that the most damning evidence was still waiting to be said out loud. The final meeting was set for dusk, not by design but by inevitability, because some conversations seemed to demand low light and long shadows, and when the caller arrived, escorted through corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, he looked smaller than before, as if each truth he had released had taken something physical with it, leaving behind a man hollowed out by years of deferred consequence. He did not sit right away, paced instead, eyes tracing the edges of the room, measuring exits, measuring time, and when he finally spoke, it was not with new names or dramatic revelations, but with context, the connective tissue that turns isolated facts into something dangerously coherent. And as he talked, investigators realized that the case had never been about a single night. It had been about a slow convergence of pressures that had been building for months. Eleanor Whitmore, he said, had known too much, not in the cinematic sense of secret files or coded ledgers, but in the mundane, devastating way that comes from being present when money moves without witnesses, when deals are explained casually over drinks, when trust allows doors to open that should remain closed. And once she understood the scale of what she had overheard, the question was never whether she would talk, but when. He described a meeting weeks before the disappearance, a tense gathering framed as damage control, where reassurance was offered in polished language, promises of protection, of solutions, of time, and Eleanor had listened, unconvinced, her silence read not as agreement, but as a threat. Because silence implies choice, and choice cannot be controlled. The plan, he said, was to remove her temporarily, isolate her, scare her into compliance, a calculated gamble built on the assumption that fear would be cheaper than exposure. And as he spoke, the room filled with a quiet revulsion, because the banality of the motive stripped it of any lingering mystery, replacing it with something colder and more human. The night itself unfolded with the precision of people who believed they were smarter than consequences. Codes entered, lights dimmed, a car waiting where it had waited many times before, Eleanor stepping out into the dark wrapped in a coat she had worn 100 times, trusting the familiar shape of the man beside her more than the unease tightening in her chest. He described her voice, not panicked, not pleading, but sharp with disbelief when she realized the destination was wrong, when reassurances shifted into commands, and it was there, in that narrow space between realization and resistance, that everything fractured, because control once challenged demands escalation. The caller stopped more than once, breath hitching as if the words themselves resisted being formed, and when he continued, it was to admit that what followed was never planned, that a struggle meant to be contained spilled into something irreversible, a moment where the calculation tipped and the cost became a life. Investigators pressed for specifics, locations, methods, anything that could be tested against reality, but memory blurred at the edges, trauma eroding sequence, and what remained was impressionistic rather than precise. A body moved, a vehicle driven too fast. a decision made under the pressure of panic and permanence. What struck those listening most was not the violence implied, but the aftermath described, the immediate pivot back to normalcy. Calls made, alibis confirmed, grief rehearsed, and within hours, the machinery of influence had begun to turn, smoothing surfaces, redirecting attention, ensuring that absence would be framed as mystery rather than consequence. He spoke of payments disguised as severance, favors called in without explanation, of a system so accustomed to insulating itself that the disappearance of a woman, even one as visible as Eleanor Whitmore, became a problem to be managed rather than a crime to be answered for. And as these words settled, the scope of the case expanded beyond any single suspect. Corroboration followed in unexpected ways, documents surfacing that supported fragments of his account, emails recovered from obsolete servers, calendars annotated with meetings that now carried ominous weight, and slowly, reluctantly, the narrative gained density, enough to withstand scrutiny, enough to suggest that the truth, while still incomplete, was no longer speculative. The press learned of the meeting within hours, details leaking in distorted forms, headlines oscillating between certainty and doubt, and the public response fractured along familiar lines. Those who believed confession equaled guilt, those who warned of manipulation, and those who could not reconcile the elegance of Eleanor's public life with the brutality implied by her end. The Whitmore family, long removed from the center of the investigation, was pulled back into its orbit. Statements released through counsel that spoke of relief tempered by horror, a validation shadowed by grief, and for the first time in decades, they allowed themselves to imagine not just how Eleanor vanished, but why. Yet even as momentum built, legal realities loomed, statutes questioned, evidentiary thresholds debated, and the uncomfortable truth emerged that knowing what happened and proving it in court were entirely different battles, separated by years of decay and the deliberate erosion of proof. The person identified as the architect of the plan remained untouched by arrest, shielded by layers of deniability and the absence of direct physical evidence, and that imbalance fed public anger. The sense that confession had illuminated a crime only to reveal how insulated its beneficiaries remained. Investigators pushed forward regardless, driven by a sense that resolution, even partial, mattered, that naming what had been unnamed carried its own form of justice, and they returned again and again to the timeline, to the narrow window where Eleanor was last seen alive. Searching for anything overlooked, a breakthrough came not from the night itself, but from the days after. A minor logistical detail uncovered in old shipping manifests, a vehicle rerouted, a delay explained away at the time, now glaring in retrospect, suggesting movement consistent with the caller's account. A thread thin but resilient enough to pull. As that thread was followed, it led not to closure, but to deeper entanglement, implicating entities far removed from the mansion by the bay, extending the case outward into networks that had thrived on opacity, and in doing so, it reframed Eleanor's disappearance as a symptom rather than an anomaly. The caller, confronted with the expanding scope of what he had helped reveal, seemed both relieved and terrified, aware that his cooperation had crossed a point of no return, that whatever protection silence once offered was gone, replaced by the unpredictable fallout of truth. And as the investigation entered this new phase, heavier, broader, more dangerous, the cold case transformed again, no longer just the story of a vanished heiress, but a mirror held up to a system that had learned how to make people disappear quietly, efficiently, and for a very long time, without consequence. Somewhere in that realization lay the most unsettling possibility of all, that Eleanor Whitmore's fate was not unique, that it had simply been visible enough to haunt a nation, and that reopening her case threatened to expose not just one crime, but a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The investigation widened the way storms do, quietly at first, then all at once, pressure dropping, boundaries dissolving, and as subpoenas reached further into corporate records and private correspondence, It became clear that Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance had not been an isolated act of desperation, but a calculated response to instability inside a world that depended on silence to function. What emerged was not a single villain, but a choreography, roles distributed across people who never met in the same room, each responsible for a piece small enough to rationalize, each insulated by distance from the final outcome. And that diffusion of responsibility, investigators realized, was the true architecture of the crime. Financial analysts flagged transactions timed precisely to the days following Eleanor's disappearance, not large enough to draw attention on their own, but synchronized in a way that suggested coordination, account settling, debts erased, leverage neutralized. And when overlaid with the caller's account, the picture sharpened into something disturbingly logical. The shipping manifest became central. Vessels rerouted under mundane pretenses, delays blamed on weather or port congestion. Yet one ship in particular stood out. Its itinerary altered at the last minute, its crew logs incomplete, its cargo list revised after departure. And for those tracing the case, the implication was unmistakable. That movement had occurred under cover of routine. Former crew members were located, interviewed, reluctant at first, then increasingly uneasy as questions narrowed, and one recalled an unlogged stop, a brief transfer conducted under orders he had never fully understood, a night where the ocean felt closer than usual, heavier. And though he could not say what had been moved, he remembered the urgency, the insistence on discretion. Forensics teams re-examined samples taken decades earlier from the bay itself, sediment archived and forgotten, now subjected to techniques sensitive enough to detect disturbances long erased from sight. And while the results did not deliver certainty, they added texture, corroborating the possibility that something significant had entered the water that night. Public reaction shifted again, away from fascination and toward unease, because the story now implicated systems people relied on daily, corporations they invested in, institutions they assumed were stable, and the cold case took on a new dimension, less about a vanished woman and more about how easily truth can be submerged when it threatens too many interests at once. Legal teams mobilized aggressively, challenging warrants, contesting jurisdiction, framing the investigation as speculative overreach, and for investigators, each procedural battle felt like wading through molasses. Progress slowed not by lack of insight, but by the sheer weight of resistance. The caller's protection was increased, his value to the case now undeniable, and with it came paranoia, the constant sense of being watched, of having spoken a truth that powerful people preferred buried. And in quiet moments, he admitted regret not just for what he had done, but for believing that silence would ever keep him safe. Fragments of Eleanor's personality re-emerged through personal letters and journals uncovered by the family, revealing a woman increasingly frustrated by evasive answers, increasingly vocal about transparency, and those words, written without awareness of their future weight, transformed her from an abstract victim into a catalyst, someone whose refusal to look away had set events in motion. Investigators began to understand the fears she had represented, not because she was reckless, but because she was meticulous, the kind of person who asked follow-up questions, who noticed inconsistencies, who documented conversations, and in an environment built on plausible deniability. That attention was dangerous. A recovered voicemail, long dismissed as inconsequential, was reanalyzed, its background noise enhanced, revealing a voice not previously identified, a voice that matched no known associate, and yet carried authority, issuing instructions calmly, efficiently. And though the words themselves were mundane, their tone shifted the narrative, suggesting command rather than participation. The press seized on this development, speculating about unseen figures, about a hierarchy yet to be exposed, and while much of it was conjecture, the underlying truth resonated, that Eleanor's disappearance had required approval, not just action, and that approval had likely come from someone still untouched. As pressure mounted, Cracks appeared in alliances once thought unbreakable. Former partners distancing themselves, statements subtly revised, memories suddenly clarified, and in that slow unraveling, investigators found momentum, not dramatic, not cinematic, but steady. The kind that survived scrutiny. Yet for all the progress, Eleanor Whitmore herself remained absent. No remains recovered, no definitive proof of death. And that absence continued to complicate everything, allowing doubt to persist, defenses to form, and conspiracy to masquerade as reasonable skepticism. The Whitmore family grappled with this limbo, torn between wanting answers and fearing what those answers would confirm. And in private, they acknowledged something they had never said aloud. That certainty, however painful, might finally allow them to grieve. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated strategy, weighing the strength of circumstantial evidence against the risk of failure, aware that bringing charges without a body, without a clear cause of death, would invite public scrutiny as intense as the crime itself. As weeks turned into months, the case settled into a tense equilibrium, neither advancing nor retreating, sustained by the knowledge that time, once an ally of silence, was now its enemy, because every day that passed increased the likelihood that someone else would talk, that another piece would surface, that the carefully managed narrative would collapse under its own weight. The caller, sensing this, delivered one final piece of information, a location not previously disclosed, a place he had avoided naming out of fear. And as search teams prepared to move, the atmosphere shifted again, heavy with expectation, because this was no longer about reopening a cold case. It was about confronting the possibility that the truth had been hiding in reach all along. And as the sun rose over the bay, where Eleanor Whitmore was last seen, calm and indifferent, the investigation stood on the edge of revelation or disappointment, knowing that either outcome would reverberate far beyond one vanished heiress, exposing not just what happened to her, but how easily a system can absorb a life and carry on as if nothing was ever missing. The location he finally named was not dramatic, not remote, not hidden behind miles of wilderness or guarded gates. It was ordinary, disturbingly so, a decommissioned transfer site once used for industrial waste, closed quietly in the late 90s, repurposed on paper, forgotten in practice. The kind of place that exists on the edge of awareness, where nothing important is supposed to happen, and therefore anything can. Investigators approached it without ceremony. No sirens, no press, just unmarked vehicles and people who understood the weight of expectation. Because this was not a search born of hope, it was born of probability. The cold arithmetic of a case that had narrowed itself down to places where questions went to die. The ground bore no obvious scars, years of weather and neglect smoothing over disturbances, grass growing where nothing should have grown. And as forensic teams began their methodical work, the caller watched from a distance, his face locked in something between relief and dread, aware that whatever emerged from the soil would either validate his words or condemn him to irrelevance. Hours passed, then days, each layer removed carefully, documented obsessively, and beneath concrete poured long after Eleanor Whitmore vanished. They found signs of intrusion, subtle but unmistakable, seams that didn't align, materials inconsistent with official records, evidence of a decision made quickly and executed with access rather than secrecy. When the first fragments surfaced, they did not resemble closure. They resembled possibility, degraded remains, fibers, items too altered to identify at a glance, and yet enough to stop the room, to change posture, to silence conversation, because after 30 years of absence, even ambiguity carried weight. Forensic analysis began immediately, labs working against time and expectation, and as preliminary results filtered back, they confirmed what many had feared and some had hoped, that the remains were human, female, approximate in age to Eleanor at the time of her disappearance, but not yet definitive, not yet enough to end the argument. The news broke anyway, because it always does, and the nation reacted with a collective intake of breath. headlines careful but charged, phrases like possible remains and major development dominating the cycle, and for the first time in decades, Eleanor Whitmore's name was spoken not just in the context of mystery, but mortality. The caller was taken back and for questioning, his demeanor altered, stripped of bravado, of narrative control, and when confronted with the discovery, he did not deny it, did not embellish it, simply nodded, as if acknowledging a debt long overdue, and said quietly that this was where the night had ended. He described the final moments in spare terms, no drama, no justification, just sequence of vehicles stopping, doors opening, weight transferred, decisions executed with a focus that felt inhuman even to him now. And as he spoke, investigators felt the distance between the man he had been and the man he was, bridged by 30 years of silence. What unsettled them most was how little emotion colored his account, not because he lacked it, but because he had exhausted it long ago, grief spent in private, guilt metabolized into routine, leaving behind a narrative polished by repetition. And that realization raised a darker question. How many times had this story been told before, just not to them? As evidence accumulated, legal teams recalibrated, strategies shifting from denial to containment, from dismissal to mitigation, and the person long suspected, but never charged found themselves increasingly isolated, associates distancing themselves, statements growing more cautious, language changing in subtle ways that signal preparation rather than confidence. Yet, even with remains potentially identified, the case resisted simplicity, because the condition of what was found complicated timelines, blurred cause, invited competing interpretations, and defense experts lined up to argue contamination, misidentification, coincidence, anything that could preserve doubt. The Whitmore family was notified privately, shielded from cameras as best as possible, and their response was not relief but collapse, decades of suspended grief crashing into a single moment, the knowledge that hope, however unrealistic, had finally been extinguished, replaced by something heavier but more stable, truth. They released a brief statement, thanking investigators, asking for privacy, and in those few lines, the public sensed the cost of resolution, the understanding that answers do not heal, they clarify, and clarity can be brutal. Behind the scenes, prosecutors made their move, charges drafted not just for murder, but for conspiracy, obstruction, abuse of power, reflecting the breadth of what had been uncovered. And the case that began as a disappearance now threatened to expose an entire ecosystem built on compliance and fear. Arrests followed, some quiet, some public, none dramatic enough to match the years of anticipation, because justice, when delayed, rarely arrives with spectacle. It arrives with paperwork, court dates, and the slow grind of accountability. The caller entered a different phase of existence, no longer anonymous, no longer in control of his story, his cooperation formalized, his protection conditional, and for the first time, he confronted the possibility that telling the truth does not end responsibility, it begins it. As the case moved toward trial, the nation watched with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort, because the narrative now implicated not just individuals, but assumptions about how power operates, about who is protected, about how easily a life can be absorbed into the margins when it becomes inconvenient. And through it all, Eleanor Whitmore remained central, not as an heiress, not as a headline, but as a woman whose insistence on understanding had made her dangerous, whose disappearance had revealed fault lines no one wanted to acknowledge, and whose return, even in fragments, forced a reckoning long deferred. The cold case, once defined by absence, now pulsed with presence, evidence, testimony, consequence, and yet even as it moved forward, a final unease lingered, the sense that what had been uncovered was not the full extent of the truth, that some doors would remain closed, some names unspoken, some decisions forever obscured by time and intent, because when silence lasts 30 years, it does not break cleanly, it fractures, leaving behind jagged edges, unanswered questions, and the enduring realization that justice, however delayed, can never fully restore what was taken. It can only illuminate the darkness that allowed it to happen. The courtroom became the new theater of the case, stripped of romance, heavy with procedure, a place where truth was no longer narrative but burden, carried line by line, objection by objection, and as proceedings began, it became clear that this was not a trial meant to resolve mystery. It was a trial meant to define responsibility in a story that had grown too large for a single verdict. The prosecution did not begin with Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance. They began with structure, diagrams of relationships, flows of money, chains of communication, because to understand how she vanished, they argued, the jury had to first understand the machinery that made vanishing possible. And as those systems were laid bare, the crime felt less like an aberration and more like an outcome. The caller took the stand early, his testimony anticipated, dissected, doubted before he even spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who knew he was both witness and participant, his credibility balanced precariously between remorse and self-preservation. Every sentence evaluated for motive as much as meaning. He described his role with precision, avoiding dramatics, acknowledging culpability without theatrics, and in doing so, he frustrated both sides, because he did not perform guilt the way people expect. He delivered it as fact, and that restraint unsettled the room more than tears ever could. Defense attorneys attacked relentlessly, pointing out inconsistencies, memory gaps, the convenience of cooperation, framing him as a man rewriting history to save himself. And with each challenge, the jury was reminded of the case's central tension, that the most damning testimony came from someone deeply compromised. Expert witnesses followed, forensic analysts explaining degradation, probabilities, margins of error, their language cautious, technical, designed to withstand appeal rather than satisfy curiosity. And while none could say with absolute certainty that the remains belonged to Eleanor, they spoke in likelihoods so high they felt definitive to anyone not trained to doubt. The shipping records were introduced next, once dull artifacts of commerce, now transformed into narrative anchors, showing movement where there should have been none, coordination where coincidence had been assumed, and as the jury followed those lines across screens and charts, the abstract became tangible. Then came the absence, the unanswered questions deliberately highlighted by the defense, the lack of a clear cause of death, the impossibility of reconstructing a final moment, and in that void, they argued, reasonable doubt lived comfortably, because justice requires precision, not implication. The person long suspected as the architect remained physically present throughout, composed, silent, surrounded by counsel, their expression carefully neutral, and observers noted how the room seemed to orbit them, attention drawn not by action but by implication, by the sense that the trial's true subject sat untouched by its sharpest consequences. Outside the courthouse, public opinion hardened, lines drawn between those who believed the case had already been proven and those who saw it as a cautionary tale about overreach, and that division seeped into commentary, into editorials, into quiet conversations about whether justice delayed becomes justice distorted. The Whitmore family attended selectively, their presence understated, grief disciplined by decades of restraint, and when Eleanor's letters were read aloud, her words projected into the courtroom, something shifted, because for the first time, she spoke for herself, not as a victim, not as evidence, but as a person articulating concern, curiosity, unease. Those letters did more than establish motive. They established personality, and in doing so, they challenged the defense's subtle implication that Eleanor might have chosen risk, might have wandered into danger unknowingly, because her writing revealed a woman attentive, cautious, unwilling to be placated. As the trial progressed, smaller figures emerged, facilitators, intermediaries, people who had once considered themselves peripheral, now facing scrutiny that stripped away anonymity, and their testimonies added texture, confirming fragments without ever grasping the whole. reinforcing the sense of a crime assembled from many hands that never fully touched. The judge issued frequent reminders to the jury about the limits of inference, the necessity of focusing on charges rather than story, and yet story pressed regardless, because humans understand truth through narrative, and this narrative had been 30 years in the making. When closing arguments arrived, they felt anticlimactic, careful summaries rather than crescendos, each side aware that certainty was unattainable. That persuasion would hinge on how much doubt the jury was willing to tolerate in exchange for accountability. Deliberations stretched on, days folding into one another, the jury sequestered with binders of evidence and the knowledge that whatever decision they reached would be dissected for years to come. And in that waiting, the nation returned to holding its breath, familiar now with the posture. The verdict, when it came, was fragmented, convictions on some counts, acquittals on others, accountability distributed unevenly, and the reaction was immediate and conflicted, relief tangled with frustration, applause colliding with outrage, because the outcome mirrored the case itself, partial, complex, unsatisfying. Sentencing followed, measured in years that felt both heavy and insufficient, and as those numbers were read aloud, the caller lowered his head, not in shock, but in resignation, while the alleged architect remained free, legally untouched, morally indicted in the court of public opinion. Appeals were filed within hours, the legal process grinding onward, and the cold case, though technically resolved in the eyes of the system, refused to settle into closure, because resolution had arrived without completeness. In interviews afterward, investigators spoke carefully, acknowledging progress while admitting limits, and one remarked that the case had taught them less about how crimes are committed and more about how they are maintained, sustained by silence, by fear, by systems designed to outlast scrutiny. For the public, the trial shifted the meaning of the story, no longer a mystery waiting for a twist, but a lesson in complexity, in how truth can be both revealed and obscured by the same process. And in that reframing, fascination gave way to something heavier, a lingering discomfort. Eleanor Whitmore's name entered a different register, no longer followed by the word vanished, but by unresolved, a qualifier that felt accurate if incomplete, because while parts of her story had been spoken aloud, others remained locked in rooms no one could legally enter. And as the courthouse emptied, cameras dismantled, and life resumed its familiar rhythms, the cold case left behind a residue, an awareness that justice is not a single moment, but an ongoing negotiation with imperfection, and that some stories, even when told in full view, never truly end. After the verdicts, silence returned in a different shape, not the hollow absence that followed Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance, but a dense, uncomfortable quiet, the kind that settles after something irreversible has happened, when the noise fades and only consequences remain. And in that quiet, the case began its second life, not in courtrooms, but in memory. Appeals moved forward as expected, motions filed with clinical efficiency, arguments refined into legal language stripped of emotion. And while headlines tracked each development dutifully, the public's attention shifted, fatigue setting in. Because outrage is difficult to sustain once it becomes procedural. Yet beneath that surface disengagement, the case continued to work its way into institutions, prompting audits, internal reviews, policy changes framed as routine but motivated by fear. Because Eleanor's story had exposed vulnerabilities no one wanted to see replicated, the corporations implicated issued statements about reforms and transparency, carefully worded acknowledgments that stopped short of responsibility. And for many watching, those statements felt like echoes of the same language that had once smoothed over a disappearance, reassuring, vague, and designed to absorb impact without changing structure. The alleged architect of the plan retreated further from public view, life narrowing into controlled appearances and prepared remarks, and while no charges followed, the shadow remained, every achievement now accompanied by an unspoken asterisk, every photograph dissected for signs of discomfort, guilt projected onto posture and pause. For investigators, the case entered a liminal phase, officially closed yet practically unfinished, because new information still surfaced, late, partial, often unverifiable, people emboldened by the trial to speak, but constrained by time and memory, offering fragments that confirm direction, but not destination. One former intermediary came forward quietly, describing conversations once dismissed as hypothetical, jokes made in poor taste that now read as rehearsal. And though his account added nothing admissible, it reinforced a truth the investigation had come to accept, that Eleanor's disappearance had been discussed long before it occurred, normalized through repetition. The caller, now serving his sentence, became a subject of debate in his own right, portrayed alternately as a coward who waited too long and a catalyst who finally broke the silence, and in rare interviews conducted through layers of permission. He spoke less about Eleanor and more about the cost of complicity, about how easy it is to convince yourself that being a small part of something absolves you of responsibility for the whole. Those interviews unsettled audiences, not because they excused him, but because they were familiar, echoing justifications heard in boardrooms and offices everywhere. The quiet logic that says this isn't my decision, this isn't my fault, until suddenly it is. The Whitmore family withdrew almost completely, declining further media engagement, their grief now private, no longer needing validation from exposure, and in occasional statements, they emphasized something simple, that Eleanor had not been reckless, not naive, but principled, and that her disappearance should be remembered not as tragedy alone, but as warning. Memorials appeared briefly, flowers at the bay, messages taped to railings, gestures of collective mourning delayed by decades, and then they too faded, because societies are practiced at moving on, even from stories that once consumed them. In academic circles, the case was dissected relentlessly, cited in studies of corporate crime, prosecutorial limits, the psychology of delayed confession, and in those analyses, Eleanor Whitmore became an example, a data point, her life distilled into lessons. And while that abstraction felt necessary to some, it troubled others. The sense that distance was once again softening impact. Journalists who had covered the case from the beginning reflected openly on their role, questioning what had been missed, what had been accepted too easily, and whether the early framing of Eleanor as an heiress rather than a person had subtly influenced how seriously her disappearance was taken. That self-examination extended outward, prompting conversations about whose stories are pursued, whose mysteries are allowed to linger, and whose absence is normalized. And in that reckoning, the case revealed not just institutional failures, but cultural ones. Years passed again, but differently this time, not as erosion, but as sediment, layers of understanding building rather than wearing away. And while no new charges emerged, the ripple effects continued, careers altered, alliances reshaped, reputations permanently unsettled. Occasionally, a new document would surface through a records request, an email or memo that added nuance without altering conclusions, and each release reignited a brief flare of attention, reminders that the story, though dormant, was not inert. The bay itself changed, development advancing, the mansion renovated, then sold, its history acknowledged only in footnotes, and visitors walked its halls unaware of what had once unfolded there. Proof that places remember only if people insist they do. In schools of law and ethics, Eleanor's case was taught not as a puzzle solved, but as a scenario debated, students arguing whether justice had been served, whether outcomes mattered more than process, whether delayed truth retains moral force. And those debates mirrored the larger societal unease the case had left behind. For those who had lived through the original disappearance, the resolution brought an unexpected emotion, not closure, but displacement, the realization that a mystery had anchored decades of speculation, and without it, there was a strange emptiness, as if certainty had stolen something as well. The phrase cold case took on a different resonance, no longer shorthand for abandonment, but for endurance, for stories that resist burial, that wait for conditions to change, for someone to speak, for technology to catch up, for courage to outweigh fear. Eleanor Whitmore's name remained searchable, clickable, eternally linked to that night. And yet within the noise, there was a quieter legacy. Policies tightened, questions asked sooner, skepticism sharpened. Subtle shifts born of a collective unwillingness to accept another disappearance, so easily explained away. And still, at the edges of the story, uncertainty lingered about the full extent of involvement, about decisions never documented, about conversations that died with their speakers, and that uncertainty served as a final reminder that truth, once delayed, arrives incomplete. The cold case had been reopened, examined, partially answered, but like all stories rooted in power and silence, it left behind more than conclusions. It left behind responsibility, the obligation to remember not just what happened, but how long it took to admit that it had. Time did what it always does after a reckoning. It normalized the damage, absorbed the shock into routine, and as headlines faded into archives, the Eleanor Whitmore case slipped into a quieter phase, not forgotten, but relegated to reference, a story cited rather than followed, and in that quiet, its most unsettling questions lingered without urgency. Investigators who had lived inside the case for years found themselves adjusting to its absence. Desks cleared, evidence rooms reorganized, their professional lives moving on while a part of their attention remained fixed on what had never quite aligned. Because even after convictions and confessions, there were moments in the timeline that resisted explanation. One such moment centered on the hours immediately following Eleanor's disappearance, a narrow window where communication spiked briefly and then went silent, a flurry of coordination that had never been fully decoded, and analysts revisiting those records noticed something subtle, a pattern of redundancy, as if instructions had been issued twice through different channels, a safeguard against failure. That redundancy suggested fear, not of the act itself, but of exposure, the anxiety of people accustomed to control realizing how fragile it becomes once a human variable is introduced. And this insight reframed the crime yet again. Less a bold move than a desperate one. A retired investigator published a memoir years later, careful, measured, but revealing one detail that reignited debate, an early lead dismissed under pressure, a potential witness discouraged from pursuing what they had seen, not through threat, but through persuasion. A reminder of how influence often operates invisibly, smoothing paths rather than blocking them. The revelation sparked brief outrage. Internal reviews promised transparency, but the statute of limitations shielded everyone involved, and the incident settled into the long list of things acknowledged but unresolved, reinforcing the case's legacy as one defined by partial accountability. In the prison where the caller served his sentence, he became a point of quiet curiosity, a man associated with a story larger than himself, and those who encountered him described someone diminished, not by punishment alone, but by the knowledge that speaking late had not absolved him. It had merely clarified his place in the narrative. He declined further interviews, citing exhaustion, and in letters never sent, later shared through his attorney, he wrote about Eleanor not as a symbol, but as a presence that returned uninvited, in dreams, in idle moments, in the simple act of hearing water at night, and those reflections, stripped of self-defense, hinted at a remorse that had no audience. The alleged architect continued to operate within the boundaries of legality, their influence reduced but intact, and over time, public anger softened into resignation, a familiar arc in cases where the law reaches its limit before moral satisfaction is achieved. Younger generations encounter the case through documentaries and podcasts, its details condensed, stylized, and in that retelling, nuance often gave way to clarity, villains sharpened, timeline simplified, and while this made the story accessible, it also risked turning a complex failure into a digestible myth. Scholars pushed back against that simplification, emphasizing the systemic elements, the incentives that reward silence, the structures that diffuse blame, arguing that Eleanor Whitmore's case mattered not because it was extraordinary, but because it was disturbingly plausible. In one such lecture, a professor posed a question that circulated widely afterward, asking not who killed Eleanor Whitmore, but how many people benefited from not asking that question for 30 years. And in that reframing, the case regained its edge. The bay where Eleanor was last seen became a site of quiet pilgrimage for some, true crime tourists, students, locals revisiting memory, and while nothing marked the spot officially, the act of standing there carried weight. The understanding that ordinary places can absorb extraordinary acts without leaving visible scars. Developers proposed renaming the area, rebranding its history, and the pushback was immediate, subtle but firm, a sign that the community had internalized the lesson that erasure invites repetition. Legal reforms inspired by the case moved slowly, amendments debated, loopholes narrowed, and though no single change bore Eleanor's name, their cumulative effect reflected her legacy, the recognition that delayed justice demands structural correction, not just individual punishment. The Whitmore estate established a foundation in her memory, focused on whistleblower protection and transparency, a quiet counterpoint to the violence that had defined her disappearance, and in that work, her family found a purpose that did not depend on outcomes they could not control. Still, uncertainty remained, especially around the final moments, details forever lost to time and decay. And that uncertainty, rather than diminishing the story, deepened it, reminding those who followed it that not all truths can be retrieved once they are buried long enough. The phrase confession after 30 years took on a bittersweet tone, evidence of courage and failure intertwined, proof that truth delayed can still matter, but never as much as truth spoken in time. As anniversaries passed, fewer people marked the date explicitly, yet the case resurfaced unpredictably, invoked whenever another disappearance stalled, another investigation cooled, serving as both warning and precedent. And in those moments, Eleanor Whitmore's story continued to speak, not loudly, not conclusively, but persistently, a reminder that cold cases are not defined by lack of information, but by the choices people make about what to protect, what to reveal, and how long they believe silence can hold. Because in the end, the most enduring mystery was not how Eleanor vanished, but how easily so many accepted that she could, and what that acceptance says about the worlds we build, the systems we trust, and the cost paid by those who refuse to look away. Years after the trial, after the appeals thinned into footnotes and the case settled into its place among legal precedents and cultural memory, something subtle but significant began to happen. Not a revelation, not a confession, but a shift in how the story was spoken about. The language changing in ways that revealed unease rather than certainty. Former associates of the alleged architect began to distance themselves publicly, not with accusations, but with omission, names left out of acknowledgments, collaborations quietly ended, invitations no longer extended, and while none of this amounted to proof, it reflected a collective recalibration, the instinctive move away from a gravity that had become too heavy to ignore. Internal documents surfaced through unrelated litigation, emails tangentially connected, never intended to reference Eleanor Whitmore, yet echoing the same priorities, the same emphasis on containment, on minimizing exposure, on treating risk as a variable to be managed rather than a warning to stop. And those documents confirmed what many had suspected, that Eleanor's case was not an exception. It was a moment where the system briefly failed to seal itself completely. Journalists revisiting the case noticed this pattern and began reframing their retrospectives, focusing less on the crime itself and more on the long arc of avoidance that followed. The decades or absence was easier than accountability, and in doing so, they shifted the emotional center of the story from shock to recognition. In interviews, former prosecutors admitted privately what they could not say on record, that the case had pressed against the outer limits of what the law could reach, that decisions had been made not because evidence was lacking, but because risk was high, and those admissions, when paraphrased carefully, fed a growing cynicism about the gap between justice as ideal and justice as practice. The caller's health declined, age and stress converging, and in his final correspondence, released posthumously with family consent. He wrote not about guilt, but about timing, about the delusion that there is ever a right moment to tell the truth once harm has been done. And those words resonated because they stripped the confession of heroism, leaving only regret. He described moments investigators had never asked about, small sensory details, the sound of gravel under tires, the smell of oil and water, Eleanor's silence near the end. And while none of it altered legal outcomes, it deepened the human cost, reminding readers that behind systems and strategies, there had been a woman experiencing the realization that trust had been fatally misplaced. Those letters reignited debate, not about his culpability, but about the limits of confession itself, whether truth spoken late serves the victim or the speaker. And in that debate, Eleanor's absence remained the central, unanswerable weight. The alleged architect issued a rare statement in response, brief, controlled, denying direct involvement while expressing sympathy, a rhetorical balance perfected over a career. And the reaction was immediate and polarized, some accepting it as the final word, others reading it as confirmation of everything the case implied. In academic reviews, the case began to be cited alongside others not as solved, but as resolved without closure, a category that acknowledged procedural endpoints while honoring emotional incompleteness, and that framing resonated because it allowed contradiction to coexist. Justice and dissatisfaction occupying the same space. Communities affected by similar cold cases drew parallels, advocacy groups citing Eleanor Whitmore as an example of why persistence matters, why silence benefits power, why reopening old files can still produce consequences even when they fall short of perfect outcomes. The bay continued to change, storms reshaping the shoreline, developments rising and falling, and yet the place retained a quiet gravity, a sense that something unresolved lingered beneath the surface, not as haunting, but as memory. On the anniversary of her disappearance, a small, unofficial gathering took place, not announced, not organized, people leaving stones, notes, nothing permanent, gestures meant to be found and then washed away. And in that ritual, the story found a different expression, one not dependent on verdicts or proof. Those who attended spoke less about what happened and more about what followed, about the years of waiting, the normalization of absence, the way a cold case teaches a community to live with ambiguity. And in those reflections, Eleanor Whitmore became a lens rather than a subject. The phrase vanished heiress lost some of its sensational edge, replaced in careful retellings by her name alone, an intentional choice by those who understood how labels can obscure as much as they reveal. And that linguistic shift marked a quiet evolution in how the story was owned. As media cycles accelerated elsewhere, the case receded again, not into obscurity, but into context, a reference point invoked when institutions promised transparency, when whistleblowers hesitated, when power was challenged and consequences delayed. And in that long afterlife, the case achieved something rare, not resolution, but endurance, the ability to remain relevant without constant exposure, a reminder embedded rather than broadcast. Because the true legacy of the Eleanor Whitmore cold case was not the confession that shocked a nation, nor the trial that divided it, but the lingering awareness that some truths are resisted not because they are hidden too well, but because too many people prefer them undiscovered. And as long as that awareness persists, as long as her story is recalled not as spectacle but as caution, the case remains open in the only sense that truly matters, open as a question directed at the present, asking who is being protected, who is being ignored, and how long we believe silence can still be mistaken for peace. In the end, the story did not close the way stories are expected to close, with a final sentence, a decisive image, a sense of completion that allows everyone to stand up and leave, because real cold cases do not end, they thin out, they disperse. They settle into the background like a low-frequency hum that only becomes noticeable when everything else goes quiet. Years after the last filing, the last interview, the last carefully worded statement, Eleanor Whitmore's name still surfaced in moments of tension, spoken softly in meetings where risk was being assessed, referenced obliquely when someone suggested waiting, delaying, letting time smooth things over. And in those moments, her absence functioned as a warning more than a memory. Investigators who had carried the case into its final phase retired one by one, their successors inheriting not files but lessons, the understanding that some cases are not solved by brilliance or persistence alone, but by the rare alignment of courage, technology, and timing, and that even then, the outcome may fall short of justice imagined. One of them said later, off the record, that the most disturbing part had not been the crime itself, but how normal everything around it had seemed, how many people had gone to work the next morning unaware that a woman had been erased overnight, and how quickly the world had adjusted to her absence. The mansion by the bay changed hands again, renovated into something unrecognizable, its past reduced to a line in a disclosure document few bothered to read, and families lived there without ever sensing the weight of what had once happened inside its walls. Proof that history does not haunt places, it haunts people. Eleanor's foundation continued its work quietly, funding protections, legal support, education, and while it never referenced her disappearance directly, its existence was an act of defiance against the forces that had silenced her, a statement that transparency could outlast intimidation. Occasionally, someone new would discover the case, stumble across an article, a documentary, a clipped headline from decades earlier, and ask the same question that had been asked from the beginning. How could someone vanish like that? And the answer, never satisfying, always incomplete, remained the same, because she did not vanish. She was removed. Removed by calculation, by consensus, by the unspoken agreement that some lives are easier to erase than to confront, even when those lives are highly visible, even when they belong to someone the world believes is protected. That realization lingered longer than any verdict, because it implicated not just the guilty, but the passive, the silent, the comfortable, and it challenged the idea that evil always announces itself with violence, rather than paperwork, meetings, and polite assurances. The cold case, now archived under-resolved, carried an asterisk in the minds of those who knew it best, a recognition that resolution is not the same as truth fully told, and that some answers die not because they are unknowable, but because the moment to secure them passes. Eleanor Whitmore became, in the end, neither symbol nor statistic, but a presence woven into professional ethics, journalistic caution, legal debate, and personal conscience. Her story resurfacing whenever someone hesitated before speaking, weighing safety against integrity. And that may be the most enduring consequence of all, that a disappearance once framed as mystery evolved into a measure, a way to test how much silence a system can tolerate before it begins to fracture. No final confession arrived to complete the picture, no hidden recording surfaced to remove all doubt, and perhaps that absence was fitting, because certainty had never been the point, accountability had. The nation moved on, as nations do, but it did not move unchanged, and in that subtle shift, in the sharpened skepticism toward power and the renewed insistence on transparency, Eleanor Whitmore's voice could still be heard, not as sound, but as pressure. Pressure against forgetting, pressure against delay, pressure against the comfort of not knowing. The cold case had been reopened, examined, argued, and partially answered, but its true ending existed not in court records or headlines. It existed in the unresolved tension it left behind, the awareness that silence is never neutral, that waiting is a choice, and that every unanswered question carries a cost paid by someone, somewhere, in real time. And so the story ends where it began, not with certainty, but with absence, an empty space where a life should have continued, a space that refuses to close, reminding anyone who listens that some truths do not disappear when ignored. They wait. They wait in files. They wait in memory. They wait in the quiet moments when the world slows just enough for the past to catch up. And when they finally surface, decades later, they do not arrive as relief. They arrive as reckoning, asking not just what happened, but why it was allowed to take so long to ask. Even after everything had been said, After testimony hardened into transcripts and memory was flattened into record, the case refused to stay still. Because some stories do not end when the law stops speaking, they linger in the gaps between what was proven and what was merely understood. And in those gaps, Eleanor Whitmore continued to exist. It surfaced first in small ways. An investigator waking from a dream where a detail finally aligned too late to matter. A journalist rereading an old notebook and noticing a name circled but never followed. A lawyer pausing mid-argument, struck by the familiar shape of a justification once used to excuse delay. And each of those moments carried the same quiet realization that the case was no longer about Eleanor alone. It was about the reflex to look away. A decade after the verdicts, an internal training document from a federal agency leaked unintentionally, mundane, procedural, yet buried within it was a case study unmistakably drawn from the Whitmore investigation, anonymized but recognizable, outlining failures of early coordination, deference to influence, hesitation framed as caution, and though no one was disciplined for what it revealed, the document confirmed something many had suspected, that the case had altered institutional behavior in ways no public statement ever admitted. Younger investigators read it without the emotional weight of those who had lived through the disappearance, but even they felt its gravity. The implicit warning that some cases do not go cold because evidence disappears, they go cold because resolve does. And that awareness became part of professional inheritance, passed down quietly, without ceremony. In media, the tone continued to evolve, the sensational edges sanded down, the language more precise, less forgiving, and when new cold cases emerged, reporters invoked Eleanor Whitmore not as spectacle, but as context, a reminder of what happens when early certainty replaces early skepticism. The caller's death closed one door permanently, taking with it the possibility of further clarification. And though some framed as relief, others felt it as loss, the extinguishing of a voice that, however compromised, had still carried fragments of truth no one else possessed. Speculation followed, inevitable, about what he might have taken with him. Names never spoken, details withheld out of fear or habit, and in that speculation lived a quiet frustration, the understanding that delayed confession is always incomplete, because memory erodes and courage has limits. The alleged architect aged into irrelevance, their influence diluted, their legacy contested, and when they eventually stepped away from public life, there was no announcement, no reckoning, just absence, a symmetry not lost on those who had followed the case closely. Some saw that as injustice, others as inevitability, and the divide reflected a broader tension the case had exposed, between moral clarity and legal constraint, between what society knows and what it can prove. The Whitmore Foundation expanded its scope internationally, supporting investigative journalism, legal reform, and protection for those who speak early rather than late. And in that expansion, Eleanor's name appeared less often, deliberately so, her family choosing impact over remembrance, action over narrative. Yet even without her name attached, the influence was evident, reporters citing grants that allowed them to pursue stories longer, lawyers taking cases others would have declined, individuals choosing to come forward sooner because they had learned what waiting can cost. In classrooms, the case became a thought experiment. Students asked to identify the moment where intervention might have changed everything, and answers varied, some pointing to the night itself, others to the weeks before, the meetings, the conversations where warning signs were softened into reassurance, and in that exercise, the true lesson emerged, that disasters are rarely sudden, they're assembled incrementally. The bay remained unchanged in its indifference, water moving in rhythms older than any crime, and those who stood there now did so without expectation, understanding that the place could offer no answers, only perspective. The sense of scale that comes from realizing how small human secrets are against time, and how devastating they can still be. Every so often, a letter arrived at a newsroom or an agency, and signed, vague, hinting at knowledge, and each was examined, weighed, dismissed or archived, The process itself now informed by Eleanor's case. Skepticism sharpened, patience recalibrated, no longer assuming silence meant insignificance. Nothing explosive ever came of those letters. No final twist, no missing piece that reframed everything, and gradually, people stopped expecting one, accepting that the story's power lay not in what might still emerge, but in what already had. The phrase confession after 30 years lost its dramatic sheen, replaced in professional circles by a more sobering one. Too late to fully repair, and that shift mattered, because it reframed confession not as redemption, but as responsibility delayed. Eleanor Whitmore's story persisted in that reframing, a constant reference point whenever someone argued that time would make a problem smaller, that waiting would make truth safer, that silence was neutral. It was not. The cold case had taught that silence compounds harm, that delay protects systems, not people, and that every unanswered question accrues interest, paid eventually by those with the least power to resist. And so, even as the world moved further away from the night Eleanor disappeared, the distance did not diminish her presence, it clarified it, her absence functioning as a negative space that shaped behavior, policy, and conscience. No final chapter closed the book, no definitive statement settled every doubt, but perhaps that was the point, because some stories are not meant to conclude cleanly. They are meant to remain open enough to matter, open enough to caution, open enough to instruct, open enough to unsettle. The Eleanor Whitmore cold case did not end with certainty. It ended with awareness, the understanding that truth delayed is truth diminished, that power unchallenged grows bold, and that disappearance, whether physical or moral, is never accidental. And in that awareness, carried forward quietly, imperfectly, the story continued, not as mystery, not as headline, but as pressure, steady and unresolved, pressing against the present, asking again and again, not what happened then, but what is being allowed to happen now. Long after the case stopped being cited in courtrooms and classrooms, long after Eleanor Whitmore's name faded from trending lists and anniversary roundups, the story found its final, quiet form, not as evidence, not as warning, but as instinct. Something people carried without always knowing where it came from. It appeared in hesitation. In that moment before a document was signed, before a report was softened, before concern was dismissed as unlikely. And in that pause lived the residue of a cold case that had taught a generation how fragile certainty really is. Former investigators described it as a kind of professional scar tissue, the sensitivity that develops after damage, an awareness that absence can be engineered, that nothing about a disappearance is neutral, and that the most dangerous crimes are often the ones that look administrative rather than violent. Journalists felt it too, an impatience with official reassurances, a reluctance to accept no comment as an endpoint, and when asked why they pursued certain stories longer than necessary, some cited Eleanor Whitmore without explanation, trusting that those who understood would understand. Even within corporations, places once defined by silence and efficiency, the case left an imprint, compliance trainings rewritten, escalation protocols clarified, quiet reminders embedded in policy language, all without ever naming the woman whose disappearance had made those changes feel necessary. This was the case's last transformation, from story to reflex, from anomaly to reference, and in that transformation, its power endured. Occasionally, someone would still ask the original question, usually late at night, after consuming every available retelling, wanting to know what really happened, wanting a version without gaps, without ambiguity, without compromise, and the answer remained unsatisfying. Because reality had never offered that version. What really happened was not a single act, but a sequence of permissions, each one small enough to justify, each one dependent on the belief that nothing irreversible had yet occurred, until suddenly it had. What really happened was that Eleanor Whitmore trusted a system that was already preparing to survive without her. And what followed was not just a disappearance, but a long education in how systems behave when threatened, how they delay, how they distract, how they wait for memory to thin and attention to move on. That education came at a cost that could not be reimbursed by verdicts or reforms, because it was paid in years stolen from a life that had expected continuity. In rare interviews, members of the Whitmore family spoke not of anger, but of fatigue, the exhaustion of living alongside an unanswered question for so long that it became part of identity. And when asked what they wanted people to remember, their answer was always the same: not the crime, not the mystery, but the moment before it, the time when intervention was still possible. That moment, they said, was the real tragedy. As time continued its steady work, new cases emerged, new names replaced old ones, and yet the pattern repeated often enough to feel familiar: a disappearance here, a stalled investigation there, and each time, someone would invoke Eleanor Whitmore as shorthand for vigilance. A reminder that delay has consequences, even when it feels prudent. The bay remained, unmarked and indifferent, waves erasing footprints as they always had. And perhaps that was fitting, because nature does not keep records. It is people who decide what is remembered and what is allowed to vanish. In that responsibility lay the final meaning of the case. Not that a confession came too late, not that justice was partial, not that power resisted exposure, but that attention matters early, that questions asked in time can change outcomes, and that silence, when chosen repeatedly, becomes a form of participation. The Eleanor Whitmore cold case no longer needed reopening, because it had never truly closed. It had simply migrated, from files to habits, from headlines to conscience, where it remained active, unsettled, and instructive. And so the voice that began this story does not end with resolution, because resolution was never the gift this case could offer. What it offers instead is awareness, sharp and persistent, the kind that lingers after the sound fades, asking quietly, insistently, whether the next disappearance will be treated as mystery or recognized in time as a warning. Because somewhere, in a place that looks ordinary, in a moment that feels routine, another story is always beginning. And whether it becomes a cold case depends less on what happens in the dark and more on what people choose to do once the lights come on. If there is a final chapter, it does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, in the way people change their behavior without ever naming the reason. And that is where the Eleanor Whitmore case ultimately settled, not in spectacle, but in the subconscious architecture of caution. Years later, an investigator paused over a missing person report that looked ordinary, too ordinary, and instead of filing it away, he made a call, then another, driven by discomfort he could not fully explain. And that instinct traced its lineage back to a vanished heiress and a lesson learned too slowly: that ordinariness is often the most effective disguise. A journalist declined an editor's suggestion to wait for official confirmation, choosing instead to publish carefully sourced questions. And when asked why she risked the pushback, she said only that waiting had a history, and that history had names. In a corporate office far from the Bay, a mid-level manager forwarded an email rather than deleting it, flagging a concern that could have been smoothed over, knowing it might stall a project, knowing it might cost him favor, and that decision, insignificant on its own, carried the faint echo of a woman who had once asked the wrong questions in the wrong room. None of these moments made headlines. None of them felt heroic, but together, they formed a quiet counter-narrative to the one that had allowed Eleanor Whitmore to disappear. The case stopped being discussed as an event and began to exist as a reference point without citation, an inherited awareness that certain patterns demand attention early, before they calcify into explanation and excuse. True crime audiences moved on, as they always do, chasing novelty, sharper twists, clearer villains, and the Whitmore case receded from that world. Its ambiguity less entertaining than answers, its discomfort harder to package, and that too felt appropriate. Because it had never been a story meant for consumption. It was a story meant for recognition. Occasionally, someone still tried to reopen it, to find one last secret, one final name. But those efforts yielded little, because what remained undiscovered was not hidden in documents or memories. It was dissolved into time, into decisions made and never recorded. And perhaps that was the last truth the case offered, that not every injustice leaves behind a retrievable artifact, that some losses are structural, embedded in moments when people chose convenience over confrontation. The Whitmore family marked no more anniversaries publicly, their mourning complete in the only way it could be, by turning outward rather than backward. And when asked in later years if they believed justice had been served, one of them answered carefully, saying justice had been attempted, and that sometimes attempt is all that history allows. The bay continued to reflect the sky, without comment, boats passing through water that no longer felt symbolic, just vast, just indifferent, and standing there no longer evoked mystery, so much as scale. The reminder that human systems are fragile constructions set against something much larger. Eleanor Whitmore's story, once framed as a cold case reopened, settled into a different category entirely, not solved, not unsolved, but absorbed, taken into the collective understanding of how disappearance really works. Not as magic, not as accident, but as process. A process that begins with silence, advances through delay, and relies on the hope that time will dull consequence enough to make it survivable. That hope had failed here, not completely, not decisively, but enough to leave marks. And those marks became the case's final evidence. Not in court, not in files, but in behavior altered, questions asked sooner, doubts taken seriously when they first appear rather than when they are safe to acknowledge. If the story still has a voice, it speaks now only in those moments, in the quiet resistance to erasure, the refusal to let absence be explained away without effort, because Eleanor Whitmore did not vanish into myth. She vanished into a system that believed it could withstand the loss. And the system was wrong. It survived, yes, but not unchanged, not unmarked, carrying forward a fracture that reminds anyone who looks closely enough that disappearance is never clean, never total, never without residue. That residue is what remains. It lingers in files reopened sooner than planned, in questions asked one meeting earlier, in silence broken before it becomes tradition. And if the story ends anywhere, it ends there, not with closure, but with vigilance, the understanding that cold cases are not defined by time past, but by time wasted, because somewhere, even now, a silence is forming, and whether it hardens into another cold case will depend on whether someone remembers this one, not as a headline, not as a confession, but as a warning that arrived late and must not be ignored again. There is a moment, long after the noise has faded, when a story stops asking to be told and starts asking to be carried. And this is where the Eleanor Whitmore case finally rests, not in narration, but in responsibility, transferred quietly from those who lived it to those who learned from it. It lives now in instincts sharpened by memory, in the discomfort that rises when explanations come too quickly, when certainty arrives too neatly, when absence is framed as coincidence rather than consequence, and that discomfort, subtle and persistent, is the case's last and most honest testimony, because the truth is not that Eleanor Whitmore disappeared without a trace. The truth is that her trace was ignored long enough to fade, ignored in conversations, softened to avoid conflict, ignored in delays justified as prudence, ignored in silences mistaken for neutrality. And when the confession finally came, 30 years too late to save her, too late to fully hold everyone accountable, it did not arrive as revelation, it arrived as confirmation, confirming what the case had always suggested to those willing to sit with it long enough. That disappearance is rarely sudden. It is gradual, engineered through inaction as much as intent. The nation remembers the headline, the shock of a cold case reopened, the drama of a voice from the past breaking decades of quiet. But what remains more important is what followed, the understanding that waiting for certainty is itself a decision, one that often favors the powerful and burdens the absent. In that understanding, Eleanor Whitmore became more than the subject of a case. She became a measure, a way to gauge how societies respond when faced with uncomfortable truths, whether they lean into them early or allow time to do the work of erasure. Her story does not ask for sympathy anymore. It asks for attention to the early signs